I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and today we're taking a look comparing two really fast Audi SUVs, the recently facelifted Audi SQ7 and its brother-in-arms, the 2020 Audi SQ8. Now, naturally with this pair, there are a lot of similarities, including really important ones to do with performance. But there are also quite a lot of differences you may not have considered when looking at buying one of these two SUVs. Now, it won't shock you to hear that the main similarity is, of course, their 4-litre twin-turbo diesel V8. Here in Australia, both the SQ8 and the SQ7 are diesel performance SUVs, which gives them plenty of torque and also decent fuel economy. But even though the SQ7 has the lower number in its badge, it's actually the larger of the pair. The SQ8 is slightly smaller, it's a little bit shorter, and that means that it can't fit in a third row, but it's still a pretty large SUV, all things considered. But what it does mean is that they look a little bit different in their form. I've always thought that the Q7 looked a little bit blocky. This facelift actually softens it a bit, I reckon, with the changes that have been made to both the front end with that new blacked out single frame grille and also this rear end here with its newly added matte aluminium blade running through the lights and just a slightly softer styling. But I think the SQ8 is a real looker. Technically, it's a coupe SUV, what Audi call their sportback SUVs, but unlike the Mercedes and BMW versions, it doesn't look terrible. It actually looks really sharp, I reckon. I attribute that to the fact that the roofline isn't as sloping or as curved as a Mercedes GLE coupe or a BMW X6. There's a lot more sharp lines which suit a crossover. But ultimately what that does mean is that while the SQ8 has a really, really large boot, it doesn't have a third row, which is one thing that makes the Q7 quite a practical option. That said, there's plenty of space for your stuff and only a slight cutaway here at the rear. Whereas there's a major difference if we walk across to the Q7 together, also equipped with the power tailgate, and you'll also notice the specification on these cars is quite similar. But in this boot, which is similarly large with 5 seats in place, we have the option here, or not the option, the standard fitment of a power operated third row. So it's really easy to put those seats up and down. It's all operated by a button here, as you can see. And both cars also have really clever air suspension controls here in the boot to raise and lower the ride height. So there's a choice to be made in terms of how much practicality you need, but things get a little bit more similar inside, and we'll jump into the SQ7 first. Now, both of these cars wear quite a classic color combination with metallic gray paint outside and dark red, really fine leather inside. So we have Audi's highest grade of leather in both cars, really, really supportive seats. In fact, the same seat in both cars with heaps of electric adjustment and a massage function plus heating. You can get ventilation if you want it to, which makes a lot of sense in the hot Australian summer, but we're coming into winter currently. But also the appearance of the interior is shared between the cars. The dimensions are very, very similar in here, and the Q7, notably in this facelift, actually just picks up the Q8's interior. So that means we've got these two big touchscreens here in the center. They replace the previous hardware rotary MMI controller, which you may like or you may not like, and you can let me know below. But at least the Audi's touchscreens are very crisp. It's just hard to use them when you're on a bumpy road, which is pretty common in this country. One good thing though is that they now have wireless Apple CarPlay, among other things including a Telstra 4G connection for satellite mapping, fuel prices, parking station availability, for example, and Google Maps searches for that nav system. But you still get a beautiful virtual cockpit in both cars. Full color, really large, and quite easy to use with these nice little steering wheels as well. So practicality and opulence up front is pretty nice, and you can also get this carbon fiber trim if you want something a little bit more sporty in your large SUV. But what about in the back? Now, as we've already mentioned, the Q7 is the only car here that lets you have a third row, but I think most people will use it in 5-seat mode most of the time, and if you do that, loads of headroom, legroom is cavernous, and you got lots of toe room. But if you need to make room for those in the third row, Even with the seat at its most forward setting, I actually still have enough legroom, which I think is pretty impressive. So the Q7 is very practical. Let's jump straight into the back seat of the Q8 and see how that compares. The space on offer is broadly similar. Now this SQ8 is fitted with the electric Sutton blinds, which are pretty opulent. They do keep it a bit darker in here, so if you're going to fit a baby seat, that's always a good option. But the space on offer is largely similar to the SQ7. Headroom is just a little bit reduced because of that sloping roofline, but nothing major. The windows are also a touch smaller, but once again, it's slim pickings. Legroom and tow room are basically the same, and in both cars you can get 3 adults across the back because they're really wide and have quite a minor hump in the floor. You'll then see that up front, the SQ8 is so similar to the SQ7. In fact, they're so similar that I wish Audi would just include one maybe flourish for the SQ8 to let you know that you bought the Sportback version. Let me know if you agree with that down the bottom, but maybe they could have had like a flying grab handle or something like that. But either way, it's very nice and quality is good in these two cars. Even though we have this big expanse of piano black here, which I have found to be rattly in some Audis in the past, it's all fixed pretty well here. Now, we've got these lovely red seats again, super comfy, much the same. Now the virtual cockpit is a bit different. It's a little bit slimmer actually, but functionally it operates the same way, and we still have those dual touchscreens here in the SQ8, which are a bit of a matter of taste. So interior wise, it's really a choice between 5 or 7 seats. You aren't losing out much if you go for the SQ8, but one touch I really like about this Sportback version is if you go for the Napa leather trim on the dash top, you also get it on the doors here in the SQ8, whereas in the SQ7, that's a more rough plastic finish. So if you're looking at these two vehicles, a big question is going to be how they compare in the way they drive. And although on paper, they look very similar, and there are aspects that are very, very similar, mainly that engine, which we'll talk about in just a sec, these cars are not the same. The Q7 is bigger, heavier, longer, and is ultimately designed to be a 7-seat family SUV. You can't get one without 7 seats in Australia, whereas the SQ8 is a 5-seater. It's still a large SUV, but you know, it's going to have margins where it feels a little bit smaller, a bit shorter, a bit lighter, a bit more agile, and whereas the SQ7 is by no means cumbersome, but you know, it's the practical option of the pair. But that engine is the same 4-litre twin-turbo diesel V8, making 320 kilowatts of power and 900 newton meters of torque. So torque isn't a problem, even if you have 7 people aboard or you're towing a large boat or caravan. The dominant characteristic of these cars is just the extreme sufficiency of their V8 diesel engine. It works to devastating effect. They're not lightning fast off the line, particularly the Q7 or the SQ7, I should say. It's not about getting off the line with lightning quickness, because this is a diesel engine, remember, but it's about once you've got some runs on the board in terms of speed, the in-gear acceleration is beyond effortless. You know, it is a supremely confident vehicle in the engine department and reasonably economical, like 10 litres per 100 Ks in grand touring driving in the SQ7, which I think is actually very good. Now that figure will increase when towing, but by no means to the same extent as if they'd put a V8 petrol in this car, which would really blow out those figures with some mass on board. The diesel is very good at coping with extra weight, so that's nice. I also think the SQ7 is more likely to be the one of the pair used as a tow car, just a feeling. Now in terms of handling, the SQ7 theoretically is going to be a little more cumbersome. We do have a bit more length, same wheelbase, but a bit more length going on here. But if you option up the pricey but worthwhile 11 grand dynamic package, it just makes the SQ7 feel 2 sizes smaller, and cumbersome doesn't really come into it. We got great tires fitted by default. We got very, very grippy Hancooks, wide Hancooks in 22-inch wheels. That's standard. But the dynamic package brings the electromechanical leveling of the vehicle instead of steel sway bars, and that works very, very well in order to keep it flat in the corners. It's uncanny how flat it's able to sit, and the tires actually have the grip to back that up, which is pretty cool. And we also have the Quattro Sport diff, which just helps get that traction and power down on the way out of corners. it makes it feel very, very sporty. So ultimately, if you're going to use your SQ7 for these purposes, I'd go for the package. By contrast, jumping into the SQ8 nets you a very similar SUV, but one that is a little bit shorter and marginally lighter because of those shrunken dimensions just slightly, and also because that there's just less content on board, specifically those third row seats with the electric operation, which do add up to a little bit of weight, and the glass house is also a little bit smaller in the SQ8 as well. Not that those things are especially perceptible on the sorts of country roads that we use for testing, which are pretty, flowing in the main. On a really technical bit of road with several hairpins, you will notice the SQ8's slightly smaller physical dimensions. But given that these vehicles are unlikely to be chucked into, really mountainous hill climbs at 10/10ths, you'd probably go something more like an RS3 than an SQ8 for a job like that. You're really unlikely to notice the SQ8's physical dimension advantages, I don't think. There's also some other interesting differences in that the SQ8 feels, to me, a little bit softer, a little bit more plush than the SQ7. Now that could be a result of the fact that in the SQ7, the chassis is having to contain more mass. So, you need to stiffen it a little bit to keep it on the, straight and narrow while you're throwing it through curves, if I can mix my metaphors there for a moment. Whereas the SQ8 can be allowed just a little bit of extra plushness because there's less to rein in. But if you take them for an extended test drive each, you'll see what I mean. But an upside of that is that the slightly plusher suspension gives the SQ8 maybe just a touch more compliance in the comfort mode of its air suspension, but there's not a huge amount in it. Likewise, the engine obviously feels exactly the same, the tuning is identical, same with the 8-speed torque converter gearbox, that all feels just as pleasant here in the SQ8. The visibility isn't quite as good, but it's also very, very close because Audi restrain themselves from cutting out too much of the SQ8's roofline, and visibility on the whole is still very good for a large SUV like this. So what I would suggest is that really you are reaping some practicality benefits from the SQ7. It makes a little more sense to me, but if you're interested in perhaps the cutting edge of Audi's SUV design, then the SQ8 gives you something a little more different. So that's a detailed look at the differences between the 2020 Audi SQ7 and the 2020 Audi SQ8. Both of these large SUVs offer the serious beef that comes with a 4-litre twin-turbo diesel V8, but just with slight variations in form and function. I think the SQ8 is a really indulgent large SUV if you don't need a third row, and I actually think it looks a bit better than the Q7 in general. But the SQ7, on the other hand, really gives you that extra practicality, the ability to use it as potentially the world's fastest school bus, given it holds that record as the world's fastest diesel 7-seater, which is an interesting one to rattle off in the pub. But both of these cars do something pretty cool, but at a serious price. Let me know which one you'd take down below this video, or something completely different, maybe an X5M or a Mercedes GLE 63. You tell me. While you're down there, make sure to hit subscribe. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.